Okay, so now we're going to move on to an example that's a little more legal, although not quite legal yet. This is a syllabus rule, and we've worked with syllabus rules before. This is a rule on whether or not a student can use the internet in class. And so we take the basic rule as it's given to us in the exercise, and we're going to break this down. The result of the rule is that you can use the internet. So we're going to back into the elements in the causal term. What is it that triggers your ability to use the internet? Well, you're using a computer for purposes associated with class. Now, if you're using something for purposes associated with class, you don't have to use the internet, but you may use the internet. So it's a discretionary rule. The problem with this rule, and this is a problem with a lot of express rules, particularly statutes, is that there's a term in here that's ambiguous. When the statutes are initially written, legislators try to think through all of the myriad situations that might come up as they're trying to address a particular problem through legislation. However, there's always something that will come up that they hadn't thought about. And so there may be terms that they hadn't thought to define at the time because it didn't occur to them that this particular problem would happen. So with this particular rule, purposes associated with class is not defined. And so we're going to have to synthesize a rule by looking at the times that the rule has been applied and what the result has been to get a sense of what the professor means by purposes associated with class. Okay, so our basic scenario, we've got our client. Our client is in contracts class. There's a discussion of distance going on. There's a question about whether point A is closer to point B or closer to point C. The student thinks that he knows which point is closer, but isn't positive and would like to check Google Maps before he puts his neck out in class, which I'm sure we can all understand. So the client has come to you and asked you, is this a safe bet? Am I likely to incur the wrath of my professor if I do this? And so you ask, well, tell me a little bit about what's happened before. And so the student tells you about 2 different times when this rule has been applied. The first case was with the same contracts professor last year. Same decision maker, that means this is going to be binding. What happened there was that it was in contracts class. They were talking about something related to contracts. Nobody remembers exactly what. And the student was bidding on eBay. The professor was so upset with the student, and this was clearly so far beyond purposes associated with class, that the professor banned laptops for everyone for the rest of the semester. So that's at the far end of not purposes associated with class. So we definitely want to stay away from that kind of behavior. Now, can you make an argument that bidding on eBay is related to class? Sure you can. You can say that there are contracts involved in eBay, but clearly this behavior was so far away from what was going on in contracts that there was no reasonable argument to be made. The next case was this year in civil procedure. So now you've got a different professor, meaning a different decision maker. So this case is persuasive, not binding. So what happened there is the student submitted a link on the 7th Circuit's website related to standards of review. Now, standards of review is a topic often covered, but not always, in civil procedure. It's often covered more in an appellate procedure course than a civil procedure course, which usually covers trial procedure. However, it's related to procedure in civil cases, and so it's not completely outside of the realm of reasonable content. What happened here is that the professor thanked the student publicly and posted the information on the course website. So there are some gaps here in what we know. We don't know when the student gave the information to the professor, whether the student uploaded it to the course website, whether the student emailed it to the professor. But what we know is there was nothing that happened in class that the professor at least was aware of. So by looking at those 2 cases, we can start to get a sense of what is it that the professors seem to think is purposes associated with class. Now, the contracts professor and the civil procedure professor don't have to have the same rule. And even if they have the same rule, they don't have to apply it the same way. But they are they are decision makers on the same level that report to the same higher authority, just like intermediate appellate courts report to a Supreme Court, or in New York, the Court of Appeals. And so you would think that generally they would want to make consistent decisions, so that makes things a little bit easier for the higher court, because if they make really different decisions from one another, the higher court's going to step in and tell one of them that they're wrong. And no court or no decision maker likes to be told by the higher authority that they're wrong, someone else is right. So you would imagine that even though the civil procedure case isn't binding, it's still instructive on how these cases are handled. So on the one hand, we have contracts, which is way at the end of not associated with class. And then we have the civil procedure situation, which is way on the other end of the spectrum of very associated with class. So what makes them associated with class or not associated with class? Well, it seems to be that there's a relationship between the class itself and then whatever website is involved. So the relationship between contracts and eBay and between civil procedure and the Seventh Circuit seem to play a role in how serious of a violation this is, or whether it's a violation at all. In addition, there seems to be some relationship between the level of disruption. In civil procedure, there was absolutely no disruption and the student ended up being praised. In contracts, the professor felt the need to stop the middle of class and make an example of the student and shut down laptop use for the rest of the semester. That's pretty disruptive. So those are the principal differences between these two cases. In one case, there was a bad result. In one case, there was a good or a positive result. And so we're looking for what differences in the facts account for the differences in the results. And they seem to be related to the relationship of the website to the class, as well as the level of disruption caused by the website. Okay, so now let's take those pieces of information, the relationship between the class and the site, and the level of disruption, and let's move that into a synthesis chart so we can start to think about synthesizing a rule and then applying that to a set of facts. Okay, here we go. So we're going to look at our next thing here. Let me put this in full screen so that you guys can see this well. Oops, full screen. Okay. So this is the next phase. The first phase is just getting down the authority. So you've got these sort of mini case briefs on each case compared against the facts, and then we've got the rule that we're working with. Now we're moving on to the next step, where we place the cases in the synthesis chart. So remember that the two pieces of information that seem to make a difference in the outcome were the disruption or the impact on the class, as well as the relationship between the website and the class. And then we're also going to add a column for the website itself so that we can get a sense of what the facts were in each of these cases, so we've got a handy reference. This is a synthesis chart. It's going to start, the first column is going to be the cases and the years of the cases and the decision maker. The last column is going to be the result. The result should relate to the specific issue. So for example, if you've got a case, a negligence case, and you're primarily concerned about breach of a duty, then the result needs to be about breach, not about negligence as a whole. And so that'll help keep you focused on your particular issue. So we put these cases into the synthesis chart. We've got contracts from this year, civil procedure from this year, and then finally our client's case, which is contracts from this year. So contracts last year, we go across that first row. The website was eBay. The impact on the class was that it disrupted the class and likely angered the classmates. And then the relationship between the website and class, completely unrelated. The result was that the professor banned laptops for all students for the rest of the semester. Now the civil procedure case. The Seventh Circuit case, Seventh Circuit site rather, was related to standards of review. It seemed to enrich the class discussion, according to the professor. At worst, as far as the relationship, it was an indirect relationship, but there was still a relationship. At best, there was a direct relationship. So the level of relationship depends on whether or not this particular professor covers standards of review. Judging by the professor's reaction, I would say that standards of review is probably an important topic in the civil procedure course, so it's likely that there was a direct relationship, which led to our result of the professor being thanked publicly and sharing the information with the class. So now we're going to take that information and move it down into the case that we're trying to resolve. So the contracts case this year, the website was Google Maps. The impact on the class, well, if he uses Google Maps, at worst, it doesn't really enrich the class on a pivotal topic because the topic isn't really about geography. The topic has to do with contracts, and the geography question is ancillary to the main thing that's being discussed. So at worst, it addresses something that's relevant but not pivotal. At best, it really helps move the discussion along. The relationship between the website and the class, at worst, you could say it's unrelated, just completely unrelated. That's not the point. We're not talking about distances, that we just need somebody to come up with some answer so we can move on to the next part of the discussion. At best, you'd probably say it's an indirect relationship because the distance, again, isn't really the point of the discussion. The distance is just a small piece of information that relates to the point of the discussion. So at best, we've got an indirect relationship. At worst, it's unrelated. So that puts us in pretty tricky territory because if you look at the relationships in the other cases, unrelated and indirect, unrelated gets us what we don't want. An indirect relationship probably isn't going to get us what we do want, which is maybe some praise and some recognition by the professor. So you see in the result, this could really go either way. You can argue that this case is more like the contracts case or more like the civil procedure case. We're going to talk about that in the next module, how you take these synthesized rules and these cases, how you use them for analogical reasoning and make your arguments. For now, just be aware that as you craft these synthesis charts, you want to be aware of where the facts lend themselves to different interpretations. So, for example, here, the impact on the class and the relationship, there are different ways of looking at that. And so you want to think through the different ways that you could look at those facts. So when you pull all of this together, all this information together, remember we were trying to come up with a definition of purposes associated with class. So our synthesized rule, purposes associated with class, means that the information on the website has either a direct or indirect relationship with course coverage, and accessing the material does not disrupt the class. So that's our synthesized rule. Remember, with express rules, we get the rule first and we break it down into elements. With the synthesized rule, we've just gone through the process of deriving the elements first and then articulating that as a rule. So the process is exactly the reverse for synthesized rules. In the next video, we'll go through a legal example.